The White House says Russia has agreed to a 30-day ceasefire on energy and infrastructure targets in Ukraine. This follows a lengthy phone call between the US President, Donald Trump, and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Washington has described the call as a first step towards a wider truce. Talks are set to continue, quote, immediately in the Middle East. Now, this outcome falls far short of the general ceasefire agreed to by Ukraine last week. The Kremlin says President Putin raised several significant points during the call, including a request to end foreign military and intelligence assistance to Ukraine. And to get a fuller picture, I'm joined now by DW's Washington Bureau Chief Ines Pohl, by DW's Bureau Chief in Riga, Juri Rescheto, and by DW Correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Welcome to all of you. Ines, tell us more about what the White House is saying came out of this call.
Yeah, Donald Trump posted on his social media platform, Truth Social, that his phone call with President Putin was, I quote him here, very good and productive, that they agreed on an immediate ceasefire regarding energy and infrastructure. But, you know, it fell really short of the unconditional ceasefire that Ukraine already had accepted and Donald Trump actually was hoping for and had been talking a lot about the last day. So this is kind of another sign that the American president does not really understand who Vladimir Putin is and how he does politics. Trump also mentioned that the negotiations would begin soon in the Middle East. It's very likely in Saudi Arabia again.
Juri, what is the Russian take on how this call went?
Well, and if you follow the Kremlin's press release, this talk has essentially achieved nothing new except that no more bombs are to be dropped on power stations and oil factories for 30 days. And, you mentioned it, and rather surprisingly, Russia and the USA are to play ice hockey with each other again. That's also, as mentioned on the Kremlin website. Trump supported Putin's idea of organizing ice hockey matches between Russian and American ice hockey stars. What didn't come up was the complete ceasefire that the US and Ukraine wanted. I see this as clear Putin's tactic of playing a game with Trump. This game has three rules. First, agreeing with the US president on small, insignificant compromises. Today, this compromise was clearly to refrain from firing on energy objects. The second rule is to delay the negotiations. For this, Putin sets additional conditions, such as restricting mobilization in Ukraine and stopping arms deliveries. And the third rule is certain information that underlines the special nature of the relationship between Trump and Putin. This time it was the fact, you mentioned it, that it was the longest conversation between the two presidents since 1991, and that the two had agreed that Russian and American ice hockey stars should play together, a sign of a special relationship between the two heads of state.
So, Nick, coming to you, you're in Kyiv. How is this idea of a limited ceasefire and these fresh talks, which are supposed to be held in the Middle East, how is all of that going down there in Kyiv?
I think people here in Ukraine are not impressed. They didn't believe that this Trump suggestion of a 30-day ceasefire was going to amount to much, but this is even less than I think most people were expecting. Just in the last few hours, we've been hearing Russian drones flying over Kyiv being shot at by Ukraine's air defense. This suggestion by Putin doesn't even end those attacks on Ukraine's cities. As for the energy system, well, we've seen that Russia has failed to destroy Ukraine's grid. It's tried its best over this winter with plenty of attacks, but it simply hasn't worked. And actually, this is something that Putin probably wants for himself, because we've seen Ukraine's drone attacks on Russia's oil and gas facilities actually starting to bite in the last couple of months. So this is, an infinitesimal concession on his part, but obviously something that Putin believes he can sell to Trump as, as a major progress, as some kind of move forward. I think people here in Ukraine are just really worried that the West is going to take its eye off the ball if there's some kind of imitation of a process, and that the kind of support for Ukraine that it needs, especially now where American aid is becoming rare and less reliable, that basically will just allow Western countries to think that something is on its way, that diplomacy is in action, and stop doing what they need to maintain Ukraine's defences.
Russia again set out its conditions for a long-term peace in this call. Juri, can you remind us what those conditions are?
Yes, Putin's most important demand, Anya, is It remains that Ukraine shouldn't join NATO. The country should also retain its neutral status and disarm. Russia doesn't accept nuclear weapons in Ukraine and doesn't want Kyiv to buy or produce such weapons. And also no European soldiers should be stationed as peacemakers between the two countries, because Moscow sees these soldiers as NATO troops on its borders. Russia should also keep the territories it has occupied up to now. And of course, the status of the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia has annexed, is indisputable from a Russian perspective. Crimea is and remains Russian for Moscow.
Ines, the US has only recently resumed military assistance, including intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Now Putin is asking them to stop. How is this request being received in Washington?
Well, I think it's fair to say that it is very likely that Donald Trump agrees on that condition, and then he might flip it around again. You know, that is his politics. He's so unpredictable. But Anya, you know, what we have to keep in mind, there are also lawmakers up on the Hill who still care about Ukraine, and who do care about NATO, and who do care about the stand of the United States in the world. So we shall see how much longer Donald Trump can keep doing this flip-flopping policies, which is causing so much harm. But as for the moment, again, it might be very well happening that they won't give any more key information to Ukraine, just to please Vladimir Putin.
Ines, Pohl in Washington, Juri, Rescheto in Riegert, and Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Thank you so much to all of you.
And for more on this, I'm joined by Joshua Shifrinson. He's Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute and Associate Professor at the University of Maryland. Welcome to the program. Russia agreed to a limited ceasefire on Ukrainian energy infrastructure targets. How would you characterize this call between the two leaders?
Well, the call itself was very lengthy. It was estimated to be about 2 hours, and it's the second conversation between Trump and Mr. Putin. So obviously, this is a major commitment of the president's time and energy. And the fact that Putin has agreed to any kind of diminution of attacks on Ukraine is a meaningful step towards a negotiation. We were never going to get to a ceasefire, to a deal, through a series of conversations between the Americans and either Ukraine or Russia. But this creates momentum for coming to the table in Saudi Arabia.
Many of us saw this publicly televised dispute between Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office in late February that looked like a total breakdown in relations. But now negotiations seem to be going forward again. Does Zelensky appear to be on board with what Trump is doing now?
Well, funnily enough, the Russian concession given today is actually what the Ukrainians thought they would get from, or thought the Americans could get from the Russians about a week ago. So the fact that Russia has agreed to end the attacks on, or agreed to a 30-day moratorium, on attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure for Ukrainian reciprocity, it creates some real momentum for conversations going forward, and I think is very much in sympathy, in line with what Ukraine hoped it might achieve at this stage of the game. Obviously, the breakdown in communications back in February was a real shock to many observers, myself included. The fact that talks are back on the table and these conversations are occurring is real momentum, steps in the right direction.
So you're saying steps in the right direction, but aren't there still some insurmountable barriers to an actual peace deal here? I mean, Ukraine still wary to give up territory and wanting some very real protections, some security guarantees.
Yes, you're 100% right that a permanent peace deal is still very far-fetched. I simply mean that I think we are seeing some momentum towards a broader ceasefire that over time could create the foundation for a more permanent, more durable kind of peace. Certainly, Ukraine wants security guarantees. Certainly, Ukraine's European partners, European allies are interested in seeing some kind of role for themselves and some kind of additional security guarantees for Kyiv. But this is still progress of a meaningful kind. The fact that Russia and Ukraine now have basically agreed to at least some kind of moratorium, it's still a meaningful step towards some kind of diminution of the violence that we've seen for the last 3 years.
And for a long time, Ukraine was hoping to join NATO. A lot of European partners were also pushing that idea. You wrote an article a while ago that said that Ukraine should not join NATO because of the cost of expanding the alliance would outweigh the benefits. Can you explain that? And can you tell us what kind of security guarantees Ukraine could hope to get if they did not join NATO?
Sure. So in my long ago piece, I was trying to make the point that Ukraine has NATO alliance operates by the promise of mutual support. And by virtue of the alliance's non-intervention in the active war between Russia and Ukraine today, any further expansion of NATO to Ukraine would simply be not credible. In fact, it would just invite further Russian provocations that might harm the broader credibility of the alliance. As for what Ukraine may want or need going forward, there's a growing conversation, a growing consensus that NATO membership for Ukraine is probably not in the cards, raising the question of what comes next. I think we're likely to see greater Western interest, especially European interest, in bolstering Ukraine's self-defense capabilities, bolstering the Ukrainian defense industry, and creating conditions that would enable Europe, the European partners, to surge military and economic aid to Ukraine in the future, short of active intervention, should Russian aggression spike again in the future.
Okay, Joshua Shifrinson, Associate Professor at the University of Maryland. Thanks for joining us.
The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has welcomed news of the agreement between the US and Russia on a limited truce in Ukraine. He called it an important first step towards a total ceasefire. Scholz made the comments while hosting the French President Emmanuel Macron here in Berlin. The two leaders discussed Franco-German relations and the war in Ukraine. President Macron is also meeting with Friedrich Merz, Germany's Chancellor-in-waiting, during his visit to Berlin. The talks are taking place ahead of a European Council meeting later this week. Here's some of what Chancellor Scholz said about the outcome of the call between President Trump and President Putin.
We are both in complete agreement that the objective of all efforts must be a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. The ceasefire that has been announced for Ukraine's energy infrastructure can serve as an important first step towards this goal. The same can also be said of the start of talks for a truce at sea. The next step must be a complete ceasefire, and as soon as possible. Of course, and we are in agreement on this too, there must be no decisions without the involvement of Ukraine.
Our correspondent Bernd Riegert has been following the meeting between the French and German leaders and joins us now. So, Bernd, Chancellor Scholz and President Macron, they seem to sound generally positive about the outcome of this Trump-Putin call.
Well, the outgoing Chancellor and the President of France picked up the phone themselves after this phone call between Putin and Trump, and they talked to Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to reassure him that Europe would stand with Ukraine no matter what. And they also talked to some sources in Washington, they said, to verify what actually was agreed upon. And then after these phone calls, both gave the impression that the expectations that Trump himself raised were not met. And they said that the European Union will talk about more aid militarily and financially for Ukraine at the upcoming European summit on Thursday and Friday. And Emmanuel Macron stressed that Ukraine has to be at the table and nobody can negotiate without Ukraine, and also Europe should have a say in this whole game.
Mm-hmm. So a message of reassurance for Kyiv. What other topics did they address during their talks here in Berlin today?
Mr. Scholz and Mr. Macron talked about money, lots of money, because the German Parliament today issued a blank check to the German government to spend on defense, in theory, in unlimited amounts in the upcoming years. This is a turnaround in German policies, and Emmanuel Macron, the French president, congratulated Germany for this decision. He said it's very important for Germany. It's very important also for Europe, because this raises now expectations in Europe that Germany would take over a big chunk of the defense spending in Europe, in common defense spending in upcoming years. And Mr. Macron said this is very important that Germany is now taking its responsibility. And also the summit on Thursday and Friday will talk about these issues. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said it's very important that European defense capabilities will be raised, but now people are expecting that Germany will pay for that, and we will see if the next government will fulfill these expectations.
DW's Bernd Riegert. Bernd, thank you so much for that.